Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Today we welcome back Ralph Wolff, founder and former president of the Quality Assurance Commons for Higher and Postsecondary Education, and former president of WASC, the Western Association of Schools and Colleges Senior College and University Commission, where for 17 years he innovated accreditation and especially governance, assessing learning outcomes, and transparency aspects. We pick up our conversation about accreditation and the need for innovation where we left off. Ralph, welcome back to the show. I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation from last week.
Thanks, Drumm. That was a great conversation we had, and look forward to it again. This could go on for quite a while because it's a good dialogue for you and I to have with one another. You have such good experience yourself with many of these same issues.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's, last week before we got started, we were talking about the criticality of accreditation and what's important, that when you come in and you take a look at a university, accreditation should look at the entire thing. And that's how I've learned my trade in business, is being on accreditation teams, working with institutions. I'm sure you're the same way.
I agree. Well, let me just say the kind of accreditation that I was involved with and continue to be involved with is institutional. So that means looking holistically at the whole institution. And one of the topics we touched on the last time, what I would call the redefinition of what is quality and who defines quality. And secondly, how do we evaluate institutions, because they're linked to one another. So accreditation is over 100 years old. It grew and it continues to have a mindset, if you will, of a very faculty-centric model. And we see that in the standards about mandating shared governance, about faculty being responsible for the curriculum. And initially, quality was about quality of the facilities, what we call inputs, facilities, selectivity of students, when typically it was upper middle, and upper class whites who went to college other than HBCUs. But the demographics have changed dramatically. We have online education, and quality has shifted. So now accreditation, because the institutions are so large, typically we look at processes, program review, assessment of student learning, shared governance. We look for documents, policies, how they're implemented. And then we say we're looking at outcomes. And I talked last time about how I feel like we could put much more emphasis on certain outcomes because they were so much more relevant in today's world. Debt load, how many students are graduating or not graduating, and disaggregate that data. Are they graduating with employability skills and following up with those students who get jobs? What kind of jobs? The Georgetown Center on Equity in Education has done reports on who gets good jobs. And it's typically white males. And so how do we address that? How do we mentor? How do we support first-generation students and the like? So I think that quality has shifted. When Academically Adrift came out, we looked at issues of academic standards and rigor. More recently, we've been looking at employability skills, job performance, and salaries, and ability to pay off debt. That's one of the things that we tried to bring together, high-quality academic programs and employability skills with Quality Assurance Commons that I founded. But I would say that these issues of what quality means today is changing before our eyes. It's adaptability, teamwork, its ability to work with new technology, It's being able to traverse multiple careers in one's lifetime. As we see with these massive layoffs that are now occurring, that lifetime employment is no longer something that is typical of today's graduates. So I do believe quality is changing, what students need to know. And I think the way in which accreditation should be leading these kinds of conversations as it does the evaluation of institutions. Now, one thing, the way in which we formulate our standards still has that strong faculty centrism. That's not a bad thing, but there are many institutions now that have a vast majority of adjunct faculty. And we've seen that in the last 30 years, we've gone from 75% full-time faculty to really only about 35% full-time faculty. And there is a lot that's been written about that. But that means systems within institutions, we need to be evaluating how are these adjunct faculty deployed? How are they supported and trained when we focus on assessing student learning, employability skills? We need to take that into account. Governance is based on a model that's typical of traditional research universities. If we're looking for agile institutions today, does the same governance system inside an institution work? What are some new models of governance that don't eliminate the role of faculty, but allows for more quick and more decisions to be made around adapting institutions?
Yeah. So I'm hearing you say we need to do away with the faculty senate. No, I'm just kidding there.
Well, I will say this. I have seen team reports that have challenged institutions that have apparently effective faculty models calling for a more formal Senate model. And I think we have to say that there are different ways that different kinds of institutions can adapt governance to be able to serve their students more effectively. I don't want to eliminate the faculty role, but a traditional faculty senate model that is, if you will, separate from and often antagonistic to the administration can be a barrier to change. And I have seen that happen too often. And one of the greatest criticisms I've had in working with employers is it takes so long to get higher education or even a particular department to change its curriculum to serve the needs of the workplace that they're frustrated and often give up. And I've seen the Chamber of Commerce with a lot of work it's been doing, creating an alternative model to get employers to sidestep higher education.
Yeah. It's a real challenge from an accreditation perspective, from an employer perspective. Higher ed has the reputation of not changing. I mean, take a look at what happened at the beginning of COVID. It forced institutions to go online, sometimes within a week or 2 weeks, never having a program. And up to that point, you probably had 70% of the faculty full-time saying, I will never teach online. And they got online and they said, oh, this isn't so bad now that we got the work out of the way. But you've still got that, the sins of the father, the sins of the son. This is the way I learned, so this is the way it has to be. There's got to be a way to change in a quicker way and be more responsive to employers and what students need. The economy isn't what it used to be 50 years ago. You don't keep a job for your entire career. People change. So we have to adapt to it.
Absolutely. I agree with you. That's why atoning for my sins and adopting several standards, sets of standards when I was president or before even I was president of WASC. I worked on 4 different handbooks and sets of standards. And I will say that I focused heavily on academic rigor and academic quality and diversity and outcomes, not on employability. And let me cite a story. I was once deposed in a case brought by graduates of a counseling program. that counseling program did not prepare them well for licensing. The attorney for the plaintiffs asked me, and I was not a defendant, I was just asked, well, you accredited them. What standards did you apply to accredit? And it was just a program within a larger institution, one of, 100 programs. And they said, were you aware of the fact that this program had the lowest completion rate or the lowest licensing rate of any in the state of California at the time? Only about 37% of graduates were licensed, and this information was not available because it's not required of public or nonprofit institutions, only a for-profit. And truth was, I did not know. I wouldn't have known because we don't ask for that information. And I immediately said, that is relevant information given all the professional accreditation, given all the licensing. Shouldn't accreditation look at these issues of how well we are preparing graduates for licensed professions, and what kind of employer feedback should we be getting, should the institution get? And this is something that's, I would say, we don't do enough. There are many education programs where teachers' licensing is very low. We could go on with other programs. There are other nursing programs where it's very high, should be commended. So I do believe there can be a great deal more attention, first of all, paid to licensing certification issues and the performance, and we should know that. And then also employer satisfaction. Now, it shouldn't be to prepare people for just one job, to be sure, but repeatedly mentoring, internships, are cited as the two most important things that will enable people to make that transition, particularly as well as counseling and identifying the range of jobs available, particularly for first-generation underrepresented students.
Is licensure, should that be a criteria that institutional accreditors, i.e. a WASC, a Middle States, SACS, is that something that they should focus on, or should that be really in the bailiwick of specialized accreditors, programmatic?
It's a good question, and there are professional accrediting agencies. Not all programs are professionally accredited that lead to licensure. So first of all, counseling, for example, you can prepare somebody for counseling without being accredited by the counseling accrediting agency. It's not a mandate. In law, for example, you need to have ABA approval except in a very small number of states. So the answer is, I think it depends on the nature of the licensure, if it's accredited or not. What if it's on probation? Would we need to know that if a program is on probation, if you're accrediting the whole institution? And then if there's trouble, then you need to know. There's tremendous tension. We would always hear from institutions that the professional agent, the accreditors come in and make demands on that particular, we need more faculty, more resources for that. And it's one of the great reasons of getting professional accreditation, many would say, is not only external recognition, but it's a wedge to get more resources and more respect, if you will, internally within the institution. But I do think there's a role for understanding the relationship, which programs are professionally accredited. Some accreditors, institutional ones, will say, if you're professionally accredited and lead to licensure and your data is good, your program review will be different. It will be handled separately. So yeah, we should be aware of that fact. And it's when there are problems that we should be drawn in.
Mm-hmm. To me, that kind of goes to the accreditability piece. Who's holding accreditors accountable? It's the accreditor's job to hold institutions accountable, and they're doing it for the Department of Education, especially when there's the Title IV funding. But is the department really holding accreditors accountable? The ACICS is certainly one example of this, but I don't see it really happening.
Well, it's a great question, and I think there are different kinds of accountability. So let's start with having served on this SICI. There are clearly a whole set of federal regulations. And I railed against the application of those regulations that were focused on, did you have a policy? Was it written in? Did it have a piece of paper? Did you show it applied it? But there is very little on effectiveness, and there's very little in the law that allows the department to make any kind of value judgment. So it's very much a policy procedure, demonstrate you have it in many respects. In some respects, it can be very stifling around governance. The department has made a number of changes. None of the formerly regional accreditors were able to maintain relationships to be part of associations with K-12 schools. They've all now separated off. New regulations now make all formerly regional accreditors institutional and potentially national in scope. So yes, there is a form of accountability, but I would say it's not focused on effectiveness. When I was on the CECI, we worked to create a data dashboard to be able to look at the kinds of judgments that accreditors make, but there's no compilation or no analysis of who gets put on probation, what are the reasons for it across regions, nationally, or the like. The only study that I have seen Stieg Leschly did for what was called College 101, where he used a federal database and found how irregularly sanctions were used and a very small percentage of the total decisions made. No real deep underlying analysis, and that gets us back to transparency. There's a separate level of accountability, which is the character of accreditors as membership organizations and the requirement of its own commissions. The commissions are elected by the membership. So it's a conservatizing force, if you will, that membership is not going to want the accreditors to get too far ahead of where they are, because they are going to be held accountable to those standards. At the same time, people outside higher education, the policymakers, are saying, look, we have $1.7 trillion in student debt. We have the costs rising. We have attrition rate. We have inadequate preparation so-called inadequate preparation for jobs. There are these big policy issues. And the question is accreditation dealing with them effectively and articulating how it's responding effectively, communicating that well? And I think so much more could be done. And this is where public members of the commissions could play a much more important role, but the law requires 1 to 7. But are they real public members? And they're just part of it. They acculturate. That's not a bad thing. But I think there is a role to say that public members on all accrediting boards should have an awareness of what the public demands on accreditation are that are separate from, connected to, but separate from those that the membership wants. And I think we have to say that goes back to the definition of quality of the mindset. On the one hand, you see trustees now eliminating tenure, imposing post-tenure review. So we have to be careful we don't go overboard of having public members want to overreach, but as I might suggest is often the case where not a clear understanding. But I do feel there are very serious public policy issues that accreditation needs to be accountable for, that rules and law take too long to address, and the accreditors should be working to get more ahead of the curve around these issues. And the challenge that accreditors now face is that because they're potentially competing with one another by no longer being bound by regions and states that they serve, can they even work together if they are going to be competing with one another?
That's a really good point. We've talked about this. The negotiated rulemaking back in 2019 did away with distinctions between regional and national accreditors. There are no, quote, regional accreditors. They're all accreditors right now. And whereas you had a group of the regionals through CRAC. They would come together and discuss things. They don't meet anymore because they're concerned about antitrust violations, etc. So that's not necessarily a good thing. We're coming up to the end of our time. We've got about 10 minutes left. There's a couple of real hot points out there that I think we need to talk about. Polarization of higher ed, the boards. We're just seeing what's going on at that college in Sarasota where Governor DeSantis replaced or nominated a bunch of new people to the board, and they just voted a few days ago to remove the president. I mean, this goes right into the politicalization of higher education. It's not good.
No, I think one can say that one of the touchstones that accreditation has tried to preserve, and I think is being challenged by not just Governor DeSantis, but others, is the quasi-independence of publicly funded institutions from the political process. And the fact that trustees or regents are appointed by the governor can lead to very serious intervention or interference or politicization around particular gubernatorial imperatives, if you will, or ideologies. It can go in any direction. And I know that SACS has been particularly, the Southern Association is particularly prominent in addressing those issues, but I think all accreditors, because this is not just a Florida issue, it really gets to the core of, is public higher education, are these civil servants or faculty civil servants who have to respond to gubernatorial initiatives, or is there a firewall of protection? And I think that relates to the role of the board and the training of board members and their fiduciary responsibility. Is it to the governor, or is there fiduciary responsibility to protect the integrity, the quality, and the success and effectiveness of the institution? And I think that is a challenge that we're seeing in higher education, is merely an extension of the, if you will, the polarization and the politicization happening in our society. I think it's a very tough issue. Whether the transition can occur, let's just take New College from, I don't know if it's a liberal institution, but to become a great book school is a fundamental shift in its mission, having worked with great book schools. And if it were to become driven by an ideology, the governor's talked about making it similar to Hillsdale College or other institutions, that's a very dramatic shift in mission. And accreditors would need to look at that and to say, how is that being done? What are the implications? And students were recruited into one culture. How's that going to affect them? Big issue.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's clearly one issue. Another is with the doing away of, quote, regional accreditors, they're competing against one another. Do we have too many accreditors out there?
Well, I think my prediction will be to you, I hope I'll be live long enough to be able to see if this will become true, is whether in the next 10, let's say maybe 15 years, 20 years, I'm not sure there is reason for 7 formerly regional accreditors. The WASC region is divided into 2-year and 4-year and above, and Senior Commission and Community College Commission. I think if all become national and compete with one another, you have Higher Learning Commission with 19 states and 1,100 institutions. You have SACS with 11 states, 800 to 900 institutions. And then you have the rest that are much smaller in scale. I think we will see mergers. I think there is a reason to merge, and that to have 7 different accreditors makes no sense. I have thought that for the last 20 years, frankly. But let me say this, and this is one of the, going back to the issue of transparency and what I talked in the last session. We really don't know what differences there are between these 7 agencies, because we don't have access to their reports. We don't have access to their decisions in any depth of or detail. And therefore, how can we say, as many people will say, well, SACS is too rigid? Is it? It's got the QEP, the Quality Enhancement Project plan, or whatever that's QEP is. You've got different approaches done by the different accreditors. How effective are they? Who is looking at assessing the effectiveness of these accreditors in actually delivering on their promise? And because it's a black box, I strongly believe that we need much more capacity, much more analysis of the work that accreditors do, and to see what are the differences, what can they learn from one another. That's not happening, and I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, it really is. Ralph, I knew this was going to happen. I mean, we are at the end of our time again. And so I want to thank you so much for being on the show. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. Please, 3 takeaways for university presidents and boards.
First takeaway, it seems to me, is 1, support accreditation and help it change for the better. 2, transparency is not a bad thing, either for accreditors or for your own institution. Look at the models of where transparency within institutions has really made a big difference. Georgia State, the UTC system, there are many different places where this is being done, can be done. And the third issue, it seems to me, is to participate in accreditation to make it better. Drumm, you yourself have served on teams. Before I became part of the WASC staff, I served on teams, I chaired teams. It's an excellent opportunity, and I would think it's a way of learning about how others operate. And I would encourage people to get involved, but to make it better. And I think there's a lot of room to make accreditation better without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And ultimately, it's about serving our students. And our country needs a high-quality higher education system. And I would say that our system can be made better. It's facing tremendous challenges, and let's work together to make that happen.
I fully agree. Ralph, this has been fabulous. Thank you. I'm going to echo your last recommendation about serving on accreditation teams. Once someone comes up to being in any kind of leadership role, whether it be a department chair, whether it be in charge of assessment for your institution, they should get out and start serving on these teams and get a sense of how other institutions do it. They will bring back such great ideas to your own institution and will also be able to validate the great things that your institution is doing. So thank you for that.
Totally agree.
What's next for you?
Well, I think we should keep exploring these topics in writing or in other ways. I am working to support a couple of startups that are trying to bust the system, and I really do believe that we need some new approaches both to accreditation and to providing higher education to underserved students. And I'm enjoying life. I've moved to Sedona, hiking and biking and developing my spiritual side in the beauty of these red rocks here. But I love being able to continue this work, to innovate, and look forward to collaborating with so many good people who are also aligned to make our higher education system better.
Well, thank you, Ralph. I'm so pleased that you're, semi-retired at this point. You're enjoying life, and I look forward to the next time we get a chance to talk.
You bet. Likewise. Take care, Drumm.
You too. Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to our guest, Ralph Wolff, and for his sharing his thoughts on higher education accreditation and what it needs to do to stay relevant in today's higher ed world. Our next guest is Michael Feldstein, Chief Accountability Officer at eLiterate and an expert in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Michael has a strong background in both K-12 and post-secondary education and he'll be joining us to talk about AI, ML, and how it can help higher ed institutions.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.